Hey everyone, we're looking at the endocrine, skeletal, and muscular system in this lecture. So a whole bunch of systems smashed into one lecture, but we'll try and cover just some of the most essential parts of each system. To begin, the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a network of organs in your body that release these things called hormones. And the definition of a hormone is anything that is released that travels in the blood and exerts its effects elsewhere. So there's a variety of ways that your body can communicate with itself and send signals from one part to the next. But one avenue is to secrete these things called hormones, which go into your blood. That's the key here, is that they are traveling in the blood, chemical signals traveling in the blood. Now, hormones can be a variety of different types. Their composition can vary. So a hormone can either be hydrophilic, and if you're unsure what these words mean here, it's a nice review. Hydrophilic hormones are those that are water loving, and hydrophobic hormones are those that are water fearing. And depending on if they are water loving or water fearing, they'll have different mechanisms of action. So a hydrophilic hormone would be one that can't diffuse through the cell. Remember, generally things that are hydrophobic are allowed to diffuse through the cell. Much of the boundary of the cell is made of an oily substance, fatty acids. And so if something is oily, it generally can diffuse in. If something is not oily or not hydrophobic, it can't. So hydrophilic hormones, they can't diffuse right into a cell. They actually have to bind to a receptor. And this is important because it makes it such that hydrophilic hormones can only exert their effects on any cell that bears the appropriate receptor. So in other words, it makes it such that there is a more narrow target site in the body that hormone works on. So for example, you could have a hormone released in your pituitary gland, and it only works on a specific group of cells, maybe just one particular kind of cell in your adrenal gland or something like that. Okay, so it's specific target sites. Okay, hydrophobic hormones then, because they can diffuse into the cell, it doesn't necessarily, it's not required that there be a receptor protein on the surface of the cell to welcome that hormone. So it can just go into any cell, and then generally the mechanism of action is different for these type of hormones. Hydrophobic hormones generally go into the nucleus of the cell, where they'll bind to the DNA and actually cause genes to be turned on and off. In hydrophilic hormones, the hormone binds to a receptor, and the receptor goes through a bunch of changes which cause a bunch of intracellular events to happen. This happens quickly. It happens quite rapidly. Hydrophobic hormones, though, in contrast, will bind to the DNA and alter genes turning on and off, and that actually has longer lasting effects. It takes longer to initiate those effects. So a couple differences there depending on the nature of the hormone. Okay, here are some of the organs that are in the endocrine system. There is this little gland here called the pineal gland, and that's going to create a hormone known as melatonin. That's what helps to set your sleep and wake cycles. It's part of the reason that you feel sleepy when it's dark out, and when it's lighter out you feel more alert. There's the pituitary gland. This is what I like to call the endocrine command center of the body, because it releases a whole variety of hormones which can go to other places of your body and then turn on additional hormones to be made. There is the thyroid and the parathyroid gland right here. So the thyroid gland is this gland that sits right underneath your thyroid cartilage. Your thyroid cartilage is the big broad cartilage that exists in your neck. You can probably feel it. It's got your Adam's apple, the little pointy thing sticking out. Okay, well, just below that is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland, on the back of it, has 4 little designated spots here where there's a unique change in the tissue. So this is represents a separate organ. This is called the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid and the thyroid gland existing together, and these help to maintain your calcium levels in your blood. Calcium is a very important thing to keep regulated in your blood. It is what is involved in your nerves working. It's what's involved in your muscles working, so we have to keep that a very narrow range, and that's a principal job of these two glands here. There is the thymus, which sits right above the heart. It will create a variety of different hormones that help to facilitate the maturation of white blood cells. Some of the lymphocytes, the warriors of the immune system, are going to receive their training here in the thymus. Atop the kidneys, there are the adrenal glands, and actually some of the interstitial cells in the kidney actually will create some hormones as well. So you could call the kidney a partial endocrine organ. It does help to finalize some of the products that are made for a hormone known as calcitriol. And then also there's some other hormones like renin and aldosterone and things that are made, or renin that's made there. Okay, atop the kidneys are the adrenal glands. They're most well known for making epinephrine and norepinephrine, the things that govern your fight and flight response. So when specifically the fight response, if you feel like you're in a situation where it's stressful or it's dangerous, your heart is beating, your heart is beating more forcefully, there's more blood flow going to your skeletal muscles, and you're amped up and ready to fight, that's the hormone that gets that action underway. Okay, your pancreas sits right here in the middle of your abdominal cavity, right nestled underneath your stomach, and that's going to release insulin and glucagon, two hormones that regulate blood sugar. So the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland, these regulate calcium levels in your blood, and then the pancreas regulates your blood sugar, and these are two very important things to keep in a narrow range. All right, and then the gonads. So it would be the ovaries in the female anatomy and the testes in the male anatomy. And that's the survey of endocrine organs scattered throughout the human body. Okay, the skeletal system then we'll jump into. The skeletal system is broken down into two functional divisions. There's the appendicular skeleton, which is going to be composed of the appendages. And then there's the axial skeleton, which would be the vertebral column and the rib cage, as well as the cranium or the skull. Okay, so this would be axial, and this would be appendicular. Now, the adult human skeleton has about 206 bones in it. There is, I forget what the exact number is. I think I want to say about 80 bones in the axial skeleton, so that leaves us about 126 in all of the appendicular skeleton. And I want you to be familiar at least with some of the main bones here that we would find. So we'll start up at the top, we'll go down the arm, and then we'll come back and take a look at the bones that are in the leg. In the arm, we'll start off with here. This is a strut-like bone that actually keeps your arm upward, and if it was not there, your arm would actually droop down away from your body a little bit. So this little strut is called the clavicle or the collarbone. There's the bone to which your arm attaches, and that's on the back of your rib cage, and that's your shoulder blade. That's called the scapula. This first bone that makes up the upper part of your arm is called the humerus. There are two bones in your forearm, one that's on the thumb side and one that's on the pinky side. The one that's on the thumb side is called the radius, and the one that's on the pinky side is called the ulna. Okay, so a few bones there to keep track of: clavicle, scapula, humerus, radius, and ulna. Now there's a whole bunch of bones here which are called the carpal bones that make up your wrist, and you've probably heard of carpal tunnel syndrome before. Well, what that is if you were to look at a cross section of this, so let's say I made a cross section right here and was looking this way into it, those bones, here's all the carpal bones, they make something of a little bit of a tunnel here, and there's a whole bunch of tendons that go and innervate your palm and also your fingers that pass through that tunnel, and so they'd be passing right through here in these carpal bones in the carpal tunnel. And what can happen is if these strings are being pushed forward and backward too much for actions like typing and clipping clicking mouses and things, anything that requires a lot of your finger movement for a prolonged amount of time, that can start to cause some inflammation here if the friction of those tendons is so great that it starts to put some wear and tear on the nearby cells. Well, there isn't a lot of room for expansion here because it's a bony tunnel, and so if inflammation sets in, it starts pressing pretty strongly on some of the nerves that are in here, and that can cause a lot of pain in the wrist, a condition which we know as carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, here's the pelvis, and the pelvis is actually made of 6 bones. There's 3 on either side, and there's 3 that are fused together and 3 that are fused together, and then the 2 are connected together, so a total of 6 bones in each pelvis. But the first bone here that forms your thigh, this is the femur. There is then also 2 bones that are along your leg. Your shin bone, the one that's closer to the midline of your body, that's the tibia. And there's also the fibula right next to it. And so these would be sort of similar to the same thing that's happening here with the ulna and the radius, where there's 2 bones here. Now remember, there is no tibula and there's no fibia. Okay, I occasionally get students getting those confused, and it's easy to do. Okay, so there's the fibula, that's the small one that you probably can't feel. The tibia is the big broad one that you probably can reach down and feel. That's your shin bone. And in the same way that there are carpal bones in the wrist, there are tarsal bones down in the ankle. And then off of those there are a variety of bones that form your hands, and a variety of bones that form your sole of your foot. And then there's a variety of bones that form your fingers, and then there's a variety of bones that form your toes. So these are all, your toes and your fingers have a pretty similar arrangement in terms of their skeletal structure. Okay, a couple other things here. We've got the vertebral column. The vertebral column is got this big part here called the sacrum, which connects to the pelvis, and then you have all these vertebrae that are stacked up one on top of the next with a little cartilage disc in between them. Sometimes the cartilage disc can rupture, or it can burst out a little bit, become herniated, and that can cause a lot of pain. There is the rib cage here. In the rib cage, all of these ribs are attached to this bony plate on the front, which you probably can feel on the front of your chest. That's a nice shield to protect your heart and some of the softer organs underneath. Well, that shield is called the sternum. And there's a couple different parts to it. Like there's the body, which is the middle part. There's this little process called the xiphoid process down here, and there's this upper part called the manubrium, but for our class we'll just know this as the sternum. Alright, so there's some bones to learn. Now looking more microscopically then at some of the arrangement of what's going on here, there's a difference in what's called spongy bone and compact bone. So this is showing a cross section of a femur. If you were to take that bone from your thigh and run it on a bandsaw to get a cross section, this is what it would look like. There would be a big empty cavity. This is called the medullary cavity, and here's where a lot of bone marrow could be found. And then you'll also note that there is what appears to be a more solid part that encompasses the that wraps around the whole bone. And then in the heads, there's a different type of a bony material here found. So this would be called the solid stuff that you see circling around the bone. This would be the compact bone. And the spongy stuff that you see is actually called spongy bone. Now it's called spongy, a little bit of a misleading name here. Spongy not because it's soft and squishy, but spongy because it's porous with lots of holes and openings, much like a sea sponge. If you looked at it, it has a bunch of holes in it. All right, if we looked at a bigger picture then took a small cross section of this, we can see some of the microanatomy in greater detail. So here we're seeing some spongy bone. There's often spongy bone along the inner lining of the medullary cavity, same as what we would see in the heads. And the spongy bone looks like this. It's got all these little struts called trabeculae, these little parts that stick off, and they're all arranged almost like a spider web in all sorts of different directions. This is going to lend some important characteristics to spongy bone because it has these structural supports oriented in so many different directions. It is able to resist force from a variety of axes of influence. So, like if the bone was stressed in this direction or this direction or this direction, there's generally going to be some struts that are in that same direction to oppose the force. So there's a much more uniform resistance of force conferred by the arrangement of spongy bone. And it's also very spacious, so you're seeing these blood vessels and nerves and things passing through. Now the compact bone then is, much as its name suggests, much more compact. It's made up of a repeating set of functional units which are called osteons. And this is an important word to know. And what an osteon is, it looks like almost like a straw. So here we're seeing each one of these is an osteon. They're packed in with one another. And specifically, if we took one of these and we drew it out, it would look something like this. We would see concentric circles of bony material nested in one another. And this would run the whole length of the bone. And as this picture is illustrating, the space that's in between the straw, this is a functional structural part of the bone, but it's not just structural, it also, the inner region of it serves as a site for things to pass into and out of the bone. So this is like a major little highway here inside of the osteon that allows blood vessels and nerves to pass through. And so it's a pretty cool arrangement in the sense that the structural component is also the portion of the bone that provides nourishment and transport. Now, wrapping around in between each layer then are these little holes or these little caves in the bone. Bone is really solid, and so you can imagine it would be difficult for a cell to live there when a cell is not like a solid, hard substance. So there are little spaces that are carved out for bone cells to live here, and those are called the lacunae. And inside the lacunae, the holes, is where the bone cells live, which are called osteocytes. Cyte refers to a cell, osteo refers to bone, so osteocyte, literally the name means a bone cell. And there are little microscopic cracks, you can sort of see them here, which allow the nutrients that are passing through this central canal, is what it's called, to diffuse to these little regions and nourish the cells that are found in the lacunae. So a cool little arrangement of bone there. There's also like a fleshy substance that surrounds them, almost like skin. And so I think there's a big misconception that bones of the skeletal system are just like big hunks of hard matter that are dead. It's actually like a living microcosm inside of the structural thing that keeps you upright and gives some shape to your body. And I think that's pretty cool. All right, moving right along then to the muscular system. The muscular system, whole bunch of muscles here. We won't talk about a whole bunch of them, but we will point out some more prominent ones here. And I'll just go through a little survey here. So up at the top, your shoulder muscle, this is called the deltoid. And there's a little spot right between the deltoid and the biceps brachii, which is the one that we see here. And that little spot serves as an important landmark for intramuscular injections. So if you've ever received a shot, usually they put it right through the muscle here. It's a somewhat safe place because there's no major arteries or veins or anything running through there. Okay, so that's the deltoid. That's the biceps brachii. There are several different types of biceps muscles in your body. So biceps brachii helps us know that it's referring specifically to the one on the arm. This muscle right here is called the pectoralis major, or your pecs. And there's actually a pectoralis minor underneath it, so that's why we have this additional distinguisher here, the pectoralis major. The muscles that run up and down your abdomen, which could give that six-pack ab appearance, those are called the rectus abdominis muscles. There's on your leg a little strap-like muscle that goes across the front of your leg, and that's one of the longest muscles in the body. That's called the sartorius. And the sartorius is sometimes called the tailor's muscle because legend has it, tailors back in the day, when they would cross their legs to create a platform to, sew and hem garments on, it would require them to use this muscle. And so it's called the tailor's muscle because it helps to cross the legs in that fashion. Okay, this whole group of muscles on the front here, there's actually 4 muscles, 3 that you're seeing here, and then one underneath the middle one. Well, because it's 4 muscles there, we call it the quadriceps group. And on the back would be another set of muscles, which are called the hamstrings. There's 3 of them there, but you can just know them as the hamstrings. And then way down here, your calf muscle is called the gastrocnemius, with a silent C. Okay, now a little bit about how muscles work, and this gets pretty complex pretty fast, so we won't try and get into too much detail here, but I want you to at least appreciate just some of the molecular underpinnings here for how your muscles contract. Sorry, before we do that though, just a quick review that there are 3 different types of muscle, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and we've already talked about this earlier in the tissues, so I won't bring it up here, but what we're seeing when we see muscles like this, by way of review here, this is just the skeletal muscles, those that are attached to your bones. Cardiac muscle is the heart. Smooth muscle is the muscle that's found in a lot of different ducts and tubes running throughout your body. Okay, now the functional unit of skeletal muscle and also cardiac muscle, any striated muscle, is this thing called the sarcomere. And the sarcomere is just a repeating unit of really small fibers that attach to one another to facilitate a muscular contraction. And so the way that it works is, this is a illustration of a muscle cell. So we're seeing several nuclei here along the muscle cell. That muscle cell is wrapped with a membrane which is called the sarcolemma. And basically what one muscle cell is it's packed full of these things called myofibrils. So any one particular muscle cell is like, think about it almost being like a cord or a string that's made up of a lot of smaller strings. It's just a lot of these little myofibrils. And inside the myofibril are these things called myofilaments. And the myofilaments are the actual pieces that are connecting together to make the muscles shorten. There's a couple different myofilaments. There's what are known as the thick filaments, and there's what are known as the thin filaments. The thin filaments are called actin, and the thick filaments are called myosin. So these are 2 really important parts to the sarcomere that allow it to shorten. And we'll take a quick look at what this looks like. All right, so if you were to enlarge a myofibril, here we're starting to see the arrangement of these filaments. So there are these things called Z-discs or Z-lines, which, think about it being almost like a plate. And off of the plate are protruding these little poles. And the analogy I give to help conceptualize what this looks like is, the thing that comes to my mind is like one of those diffusers that somebody would put on a hair dryer. It's got these little like spiky things that comes off of the plate, and I don't even know what that thing's for. It looks like a torture device, but it does something. My wife uses it all the time, so I'm not sure what it does, but it does something. Okay, in either case, it's got these little poles sticking off of it, so that's what these little poles are here. And so you have basically a plate with the poles sticking off on either side. Okay, now there's then one of those plates here, and there's one of those plates here. Now interleaved then between the actin filaments, so here's a little pull, here's a little pull, here's a little pull, here's a little pull, is a similar type of arrangement. It looks like a diffuser, except these are the thick filaments now, and they have a functional difference to them. So if I was to show a really magnified view of the myofilaments, this is a simple illustration of what's going on molecularly. There's the actin, 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 actin. This is on the Z disc here, or the Z line. And in between them then is the myosin. Well, the myosin is different because it's not just a pole. It's actually more of like a living machine. There are these little heads on here, and the heads can grab onto actin. And when they do grab on, they pull the actin inward. So, for example, in a relaxed state, we could see that the Z disc is here, and the Z disc is here. And so if you measured it, it'd be some distance. Well, after the contraction, what's happened is all of these myosin heads have grabbed onto the actin and they've sort of walked it in. Think about these myosin heads being like little fingers that are grabbing onto the poles and then walking them in. And this is happening on either side. So if we look at this distance then between the Z discs, you can see that it's a little less than the distance it was above. So the plates have been brought in closer to one another, and this is going to lead to the muscle shortening. Well, it's the muscle shortening that is what builds tension, and it's that tension then that moves your limbs and moves your joints. So even though this is a really small, the distance between here and here is only slightly, this distance is only slightly less. Even though there's only a small amount of shortening that's happened in one sarcomere, there are millions, or thousands, probably millions of sarcomeres lined up one after the next, one after the next. So if you take this small amount of shortening that's happened and you multiply it by however many thousands of sarcomeres there are, it actually leads to a pretty significant shortening of all the muscle cells and thereby all of the muscle together. And just to give you some idea of the complexity here, it's pretty cool to appreciate that every single muscle cell, there's lots of muscle cells in each muscle that you have, every single muscle cell's got a neuron going to it that is going to give it a little zap of electricity and cause it to contract. And there's a lot of interesting molecular mechanisms at play here that I want to look at in this short little video. Okay, so this is going to show a video of the inner workings of the sarcomere. It's going to be more complicated than you need to know. You don't have to be able to go through every last little bit of this, but generally I want you to see a little bit about how the myosin binds to the actin. It's not just so simple as a myosin binding to actin, because there has to be a signal event that tells the myosin when to bind to actin and when not to. If myosin just binds to actin ad libitum, at random, then there can't be any uniform contraction and a uniform relaxation of your muscle. Okay, there has to be some signaling event, something that happens that tells the myosin when to grab on to actin and when not, and that all has to do with calcium signaling that's initiated by receiving electrical impulses from neurons, and it gets pretty complex. But I want to show you a little video that at least illustrates this, just for the sake of appreciating all of the molecular machinery at play here, and even something as simple as a small muscle twitch. And when you think about it, this is what's happening in one muscle cell, and there's thousands and thousands of muscle cells in every muscle, and there's lots and lots of muscles in your body, and they can move rapidly, all governed by the activity of the brain and all of that wiring and the arrangement of it. That's pretty fascinating. So let's go ahead here and take a look at what's going on under the hood of the muscle cell.
You use muscles every day to do activities. This woman is using muscles to breathe, circulate blood, and move her hand to take notes. Your cardiac and smooth muscle tissues are involuntary. You do not consciously control their actions. Skeletal muscle works under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells containing several nuclei. Muscles will contract or relax when they receive signals from the nervous system. A neuromuscular junction is the site of the signal exchange. This is where the synaptic bulb of an axon terminal and muscle fiber connect. Muscle fibers are composed of many myofibrils. A myofibril contains contractile units called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres run adjacent to one another down the length of the myofibril. Each sarcomere consists of alternating thick and thin protein filaments, giving skeletal muscle its striated appearance. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at the center of the sarcomere, called the M-line. The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z-lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z-lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this model, the sarcomeres shorten without the thick or thin filaments changing in length. A contraction begins when a bound ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. This causes the myosin head to extend and can attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. An action called the power stroke is triggered, allowing myosin to pull the actin filament toward the M-line, thereby shortening the sarcomere. ADP and inorganic phosphate are released during the power stroke. The myosin remains attached to actin until a new molecule of ATP binds, freeing the myosin to either go through another cycle of binding and more contraction, or remain unattached to allow the muscle to relax. Muscle contractions are controlled by the actions of calcium. The thin actin filaments are associated with regulatory proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. When a muscle is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the cross-bridge binding sites on actin. When calcium ion levels are high enough and ATP is present, calcium ions bind to the troponin, which displaces tropomyosin, exposing the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows myosin to attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and are released in response to signals from the nervous system to contract. Neurotransmitter molecules are released from a neuron and bind to receptors, which depolarizes the membrane of the muscle fiber. The electrical impulse travels down the T-tubules and opens calcium stores. Calcium ions flow to the myofibrils, where they trigger a muscle contraction. As the actin and myosin slide along each other, the entire sarcomere shortens as the Z-lines draw closer to the M-line. As the sarcomeres in myofibrils contract, the entire muscle fiber will shorten. When muscle fibers contract in unison, a muscle can produce enough force to move the body, allowing you to take notes.
Okay, so there you have it. A little overview of the endocrine system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system.